The West's greatest problem is socialism. Socialism is the loss of sovereignty. A sovereign is a person who has authority over his property. We have extended this to some autocratic rulers who wield power over a territory, but this is an extreme example. A sovereign citizen is a person who is not beholden to the state because he or she has full control over the value he or she creates. When a nation is a world power and in control of their border, the issue of socialism was a minor concern, at least for the dominant nation. Other economies and people were socialist, but the West, having dominance over so many other areas, was not socialists to any great extent. People in the West were all gainfully employed. Admittedly, this was often in the rapine of other nations, but citizens rarely became a burden to their fellow citizens. Most of the Western countries got rich as we modernized, and there was little impulse to live off of the charity of our neighbor as there is in Eastern realms. The Ashanti, as an example of socialism, were successful in funneling slaves to the West. Slavery is about as socialist as one can get. This enslavement of one's own people was never part of Western development. The closest the West got to profiteering off the enslavement of their kind was the Irish potato famine. The plight of the Irish was exploited to create the indentured servant system. But even in this case, the Irish caught up in this system were tacitly in agreement with the process because it enabled them to be transported to the U.S. The West's ability to exploit the outsider meant there was little need for our ancestors to exploit the system or our neighbor. It happened, but it never happened enough for the state to become actively involved in it. The West promised success for those who worked hard. It promised even greater success to those who were born into prosperity and worked smart. But European peoples, regardless of its prejudices more than other cultures, rewarded merit. As ruthless as the capitalism system was, it had one advantage: it was almost impossible to exploit from the outside. The social services in the West were local and usually administrated through the church. The state was and is always socialist, but it was a socialism of the rich, not the poor. The rich, who wished to, could insulate their earnings from state and church far easier than is now possible. The capitalist system was far from perfect and hardly humane, but at the time this was a cost of minimizing the power of the worst freeloaders. A person could beg and opine about his hard luck over a beer, but they did not have the power of the state behind them. The bad luck case never became a centerpiece of government policy as is the case today. In most cases, the most desperate cases were cared for by individual do-gooders or Christian-run charities. However, the fact that the weaknesses of the Western system were glossed over and neutralized for a while did not eliminate them. As the West weakened and its ability to exploit the East lessened, the need to find alternative subjects to exploit increased. But if a parasite is limited to domestic sources, who is there to exploit but the middle class? When the strengths of the system are lessened, the weaknesses of the system are revealed. Nowhere is this truer than in the experience of the West. In one of the most benign forms of domestic parasitism, banks that found fewer investment opportunities abroad had to focus more on domestic markets and ways to increase the debt load of the local market. For them, this invariably meant increasing the debt load of the middle class. In earlier days, younger sons who might have found jobs in the clergy or foreign service had to push their way into the bureaucracy. But what could this growing army of bureaucrats do but find more ways to regulate the middle class? The state became more focused on domestic social policy and less on ways to relieve the white man's burden. All of this and more contributed to a social system that would make room for more and more diverse types of administrators. As usual, who was there to pay for all of this supervision but the middle class? The difference between then and now was that the burden of the freeloader ceased to be borne by foreign economies and became centered on the middle class. The problem the West faces, which is actually the problem of the white Western middle class, is that freeloading is no longer externalized onto foreign entities. freeloading has become so prevalent and so internalized that the West faces the prospect of this parasitism turning into a terminal cancer. While politics is the main vehicle through which parasitism is imposed on society and future generations, it is the monetary system used that enables these transfers to occur. If you have a dollar with a liability attached, someone has a lien against it and anything purchased by the dollar is not technically yours. Only the unattached portion belongs to us, as is the case with a property that is mortgaged. Through the liability represented by the dollar, someone has a claim against anything obtained by the use of it. This is a facet of socialism, and it is the way free riding manifests itself in this system of things, which is inherently socialist. The pivotal point on which socialism works is a currency that is socialist. By this we mean a specific dollar cannot be traced back to a specific owner. No dollar is created by a value-creating action or person. There is always a social component to every dollar circulating in the economy. The state claims money is a medium of exchange. It is a product capable of infinite degrees of graduation because it is created in multiples of one. The decimal nature of money makes it capable of representing an infinite number of prices. One can buy a thimble or multinational corporation using the medium of exchange because currencies can be issued in any denomination and in any multiplier of 1, or fraction of 1, down to 1/100 of a unit. But fiat money is spent into the economy. So, it operates similar to taxation. Bank accounts are lent to clients at interest and has to be paid back. But the interest cannot be paid without access to fiat currency. The state spends fiat currency to give consumers the money needed to pay interest on their bank debt. The physical notes or accounts are owned by the state and the bank issuing the loan, but the value represented by the currency is not owned by anyone, in the sense that if you have sufficient currency, you can purchase anything in the market, regardless of how you got this currency. This is said to facilitate trade, but it encourages free riding even more. Why work when there are so many other ways to acquire currency? Selling drugs does not create value, nor does smash and grabs, but they give those engaging in such acts as much access to dollars as working does. This is why we must privatize the currency system and neutralize those who would acquire access to our goods and services, without producing something of value equal to the value they consume. To create value, there has to be a value-creating structure or business. We can work and earn money, but this is not the same as creating value. When one works for a business or the government, it may seem as if we are creating value, because we get paid for what we do. However, it is the business or government that creates or obtains the value. You are just part of the process. This is why the value never accrues to you but to the value-creating structure. It is possible you are manufacturing or packaging drugs or playing the stock market. Many activities create an income without creating value. To create value is to create its manifestation, which we know of as money. What we often call money is better thought of as currency. A currency is an asset turned into a medium of exchange by being issued in denominations. But money has no value. It is nothing more than a measure of value in the same way a yard is a measure of length. Money is a unit of account created to measure value and to give value a numerical representation. Thus, money is recorded in positive and negative integers called credits and debits. There are two kinds of bookkeeping. Liability or currency bookkeeping has credits and debits, but also earnings and expenses. These seem like the same thing, but earnings and expenses have two flavors which correspond to owner's capital and liabilities, which is capital belonging to other agents. Equity accounting is akin to cash accounting. Cash accounting uses a 3-column ledger recording debits and credits and the balance. The latter could be a positive or negative amount. It is not businesses and certainly not governments that create money and add value to assets. It is people, and more precisely, people working in groups that create economic development. Civilization is not created by people in the general sense of the term. Any company, regardless of where it is or what it produces, has people or is composed of people. But the business may or may not be adding value to assets. It is the obligation and purpose of all people to add value to the planet. The organization created to do this by God is the church. A business is an artificial construct created to mimic the church and to undermine God's design. In its most fundamental form, a church is simply people who have organized themselves into an informal network. People have an innate ability to work together, and when they do this, a nascent church is formed. But the natural inclination we have to come together and help one another has been thwarted and corrupted time and time again by freeloaders. When we come together, we are always in danger of being exploited. Privatization, despite what the state tells us, requires the elimination of the state. The state and church are incompatible. One encapsulates public ownership, and one is private. The private citizen exercising private ownership is a sovereign citizen. The church cannot be turned into a public body and remain Christian. A Christian cannot be a subject of the state and be sovereign. The state cannot reconcile to the church and remain a public body. Private and public are akin to flesh and spirit and are manifestations of the people of the flesh and the people of the spirit. There is an unbridgeable chasm between the two groups. A privatized monetary system does not require the state and cannot have a relationship to any public body. The interesting thing is that the generation of a private currency requires individual work. The work of an individual is as private an activity as one can get. Sovereign currency is a product of labor and makes possible the labor theory of value. When value is created by labor alone, equity is produced. A private currency is nothing more than this equity issued in decimal form. Logic requires there be two realities informed by two kinds of truth. One truth and therefore reality is analytical, the other kind of truth and therefore reality is synthetic. The first truth model produces a reality of perfect absolutes, the other reality is the liberal conception of reality. You may not like the truth of this, but there is no path by which this truth can be refuted. This doctrine of two realities is important to grasp, because the value of a liberal currency is as relative as is the rest of liberal reality. A liberal dollar is only worth what someone says it is. You might be able to purchase a horse or a coffee or both, depending on the situation. A bottle of water and a pound of gold have very different values depending on whether you are in a city or a life raft. But labor value is constant. If you are creating value by means of labor, you are creating private wealth that belongs to you. A true or analytical dollar is always worth a dollar. Analytical money is produced when we improve assets. The worker deserves his reward for the work he or she does. This is a biblical principle. But how do we privatize the currency in use? Bank accounts and government-issued fiat currencies are public assets. It is not possible to privatize currency when issued by public or semi-public institutions such as banks. But public can be converted to private by means of a sovereign act, which are always private in nature, or not sovereign. But this problem of privatizing our monetary system impacts the economy and markets. If a business is an institution licensed by the state to conduct business activities, then even our businesses are semi-public institutions. The term private enterprise is misleading. To fully privatize the economy requires the absolute rejection of all public and semi-public models. This is true whether the model is considered part of the political and economic left and right. The problem is the state and its regulatory authority, not the ideology under which the state operates. It's not complicated. We are either sovereign or fascist. You can play around with how you will move people from being sovereign to the subject of a fascist state, but you will not add to the options available to us. A person has to be sovereign to add value to assets, otherwise he is a subject of a fascist state. The asset cannot be stolen or illegitimately claimed by a fascist state, or the person is not a sovereign being. We cannot add value to stolen assets and claim this is doing good. This is why everything must be privatized, i.e., possessed by its creator, or we empower the fascist state. Assets are assets because this defines something created by God. God's creation is good, and assets are the good things of the world. God creates things that seem real to us because they are good, and this value is what we see as real, it is substantial. But this kind of creation adheres to God alone. Human beings cannot create real things. If it is real or looks real physically, it was not created by a human being. All us humans can do is add value to the things created by God. We do this by modifying the things of God so as to make them more useful to us. The value added to assets is called equity. The world is composed of two clearly defined classes of things. There are assets created by God, and there is the value humans add to these things by modifying the real things. This latter class of thing is called equity. We own the equity we create. It can be and needs to be manifested as money. Money represents equity. But to make this all possible, humans must divest themselves of what we do not rightfully own and cannot rightfully claim as our own. We need to assign all we do not own to the Church as the representative of Christ on earth. Sovereign citizens are people who work for the Church and are paid for the value they create by the Church. Sovereign citizens are paid for the value they create in preferred shares. This term can be contracted to prefers and designated by the symbol. Prefers are a unit of account. Earnings are credited to the seller and expenses are debited from the buyer's account. Earnings are never taxed because there is no public component in a sovereign jurisdiction. When what used to be called public works are required, the buyer contracts the relevant sector to provide what is needed. The account of the buyer is debited the cost of the work, and the account of the seller of the goods and services is credited. All purchases are done through the market using the prefers medium of exchange. Every purchase and sale is a transfer of labor. The labor of the buyer is exchanged for the labor of the seller, but indirectly through the unit of account. The buyer is always a seller able and willing to produce equity, as a sovereign citizen. A sovereign citizen is a person who supports him or herself through the production of equity. The seller is always a person who adds value to the assets of a community of sovereign citizens.